On November 7th, 2024, the chairman of the Federal Reserve openly defied the President of the United States of America, declaring essentially that even the leader of the free world could not supersede him.
Do you believe that the president has the power to fire or demote you, and has the Fed determined the legality of a president demoting at will any of the other governors with leadership positions?
Not permitted under the law.
Not what?
Not permitted under the law.
What kind of power can defy the leader of the free world? How are we all convinced to grant nearly unlimited power to this money printing agency? So what is the Federal Reserve, and how has it driven us towards 100 years of inequality, wars, and a $36 trillion debt bubble that's ready to burst at any moment? To understand this, we're going to need to go 110 years back to a secret meeting that was held on a private island off the coast of Georgia. This is the story of Jekyll Island.
Can I ask you a question? Yes. What do you know about the Federal Reserve?
That's too much info for right now.
We're literally going to where they created the Federal Reserve.
Good to meet you.
Nice to meet you, man.
Good giant.
Glad you guys made it.
The United States can pay any debt it has because we can always print money to do that.
We were hoping to help take down the global financial hegemony.
This is weird, man. This is strange. It feels like, it feels like an old folks retirement sanctuary, but it also feels like a little bit of an eerie feeling.
It feels out of time, right? It's like, it's not new, it's not old.
Picture this. You're an ordinary American citizen in the year 1907. In your city or a city near you, there are constant bank runs because the American financial system was very distributed, much in the same way that the internet is sort of distributed, almost like a bunch of web pages. There used to be just a bunch of banks loaning to each other, taking on each other's risks, not having one central issuer of currency. If you went from California to Florida or California to New York back in the 1800s and the 1900s, they would have a separate different currency. At one point, there were 30,000 currencies across all of the United States. That's like almost more than the amount of shitcoins in the crypto space.
The first three attempts before the Federal Reserve, we had the Bank of North America, which was going to be Canada and the United States. That was the first central bank. Then we had the first Bank of the United States in Philadelphia, opposed by Thomas Jefferson, supported by Alexander Hamilton. Then we had the second U.S. bank, dissolved by Andrew Jackson. So Andrew Jackson had sufficiently kicked out the central bankers in the 1830s, and it took many, many decades again until they tried again to bring in a central bank to the United States.
We were living within a system where people had physical gold and they would deposit that gold in banks and have paper banknotes issued in compensation for those physical gold coins.
But when I hold these things, everyone my age, millennials, Gen Z, we just think of this is the money, right? Yeah. But everyone older comes from a time when this was not the money, this was a representation of the gold. This was just a placeholder for gold that was actually in a vault somewhere. And gold has to be dug out of the ground. Gold can't be invented out of thin air. And so as long as this does represent gold, there's a limited supply.
Yeah, and for a long time that works, right? Until you have a run on the bank where everyone comes in to demand their gold. Yeah. And what happens is 10-20% of the people get their gold and the bank runs out of gold. Yeah. And that's when you have a bank run and the bank collapses.
1907, this earthquake hit San Francisco, destroys all of these buildings. Those assets end up almost nearly worthless. And so you have these banks all across one of the biggest cities in America that are just going belly up, and it causes contagion to other banks. It just takes one key player, one key event to trigger this domino wave. And basically it just set in motion all this banking panic. People were afraid, people were angry, because they looked at the banks as if it was their fault. But at the same time, the gut reaction wasn't, let's give it all over to the government. because America had fought for like hundreds of years to not have one central party controlling all the banks.
The American banking system was collapsing in real time from coast to coast, but instead of letting it crumble, distribute, and rebuild, 7 key players saw an opportunity to overhaul the entire system.
Charles Norton, President of the First National Bank of New York.
Frank Vanderlip, President of National City Bank.
Henry P. Davison, Senior Partner and Confidant of J.P. Morgan.
A. Piat Andrew, Harvard Economics Professor and Assistant Secretary of the United States Treasury Department.
Benjamin Strong Jr., Vice President of the Bankers Trust Company.
Paul Warburg, a German-born financier and descendant of the Warburg banking dynasty.
And finally, Senator Nelson Aldrich, a U.S. Senator from Rhode Island and Chairman of the National Monetary Commission.
So Aldrich is a general in the Civil War, right? But then after the Civil War, he gets into politics eventually. The Panic of 1907 happens. He gets appointed to a special panel.
He creates the National Monetary Commission, whose sole purpose is to study the 1907 banking crisis and then to create, potentially a solution. The U.S. banking system is not sufficiently centralized. There's too much risk and too many panics that, frequently cause these banks to collapse.
He winds up creating this Aldrich plan, which essentially evolved directly into creating the Federal Reserve.
They organized this meeting here at Jekyll Island, first in New Jersey in November of 1910.
And they came here and held one of the most secret meetings of all time. The only person who knew who was involved in the meeting was J.P. Morgan, because he is the one who provided them the Federal Reserve room.
And all 6 of them wanted a way to come to Jekyll Island, but without being seen together, because at the time, if any journalist found them together, it would raise some flags. Because nobody at the time wanted a central bank.
And any reporter who asked, they just said, we're going down to southern Georgia for duck hunting. No big deal.
Either duck hunting, getting away for the winter. So these 6 men all embarked on this journey to go from New York to Jekyll Island, which was around a 2-day trip. 2 of them changed their name completely, and all of them were instructed to use their first names.
And these 6 men essentially worked together for an entire weekend. They create this plan to create reserve banks, and each reserve bank will create and issue a centralized currency that will become, the currency of the United States, the sole currency of the United States, eliminating the ability of individual banks to issue their own notes.
The goals of the Aldrich Plan were to essentially create a central bank without calling it a central bank. So they did everything in their power to obfuscate it, to use different language, to try and distance themselves from this idea of one lending party that most of the public feared would end up basically absorbing every piece of capital and siphoning off all the productive wealth of the economy.
The problem with the original Aldrich Plan is that it was overtly too pro-banker. The Democrats, which were anti-centralized banking, shot it down. And so what they did is they modified it in several different ways. One of the ways they modified it was creating, the Federal Reserve Board of Governors, who would reside in Washington, D.C., and were appointed by the President and confirmed by the Senate. Now, the interesting thing that they built into, the new Federal Reserve System was that Board of Governors actually wouldn't have direct control over monetary policy. The one that would have that control was the New York Fed, the most influential of all the 12 Federal Reserve banks.
So they got President Wilson to sign the bill, and after, their main priority was like, we're gonna have him sign it, and then we will alter the rules once it is signed.
Saying the word bank was like, it was a 4-letter word. So that's why the Federal Reserve is not called a bank. They wanted to make it seem like it came from the government, so they called it federal. They wanted to make it seem like they actually had some assets, so they called it a reserve. It's neither federal and it's not a reserve.
But what I don't understand is how were they able to get away for it for so long?